decided to stick with Esther, the next book of the Bible, because there's a commonality between those themes and what goes on in Esther. I want to read the conclusion as we begin. We'll kind of summarize the book in a minute, but it concludes with a holiday of thanksgiving. And it goes like this in Esther chapter 9, beginning in verse 19. That is why, that is referring to the story of Esther, that is why rural Jews, those living in villages, observe the 14th of the month of Adar as a day of joy and feasting, a day of giving presents to each other. Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as a month when their sorrows were turned into joy, and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy, and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. Essentially what this holiday, it's referred to still on the Jewish calendar as the holiday of Purim, it's a reminder to remember that God takes care of his people. This was true then, this is true now. And it's not the same holiday, but it's similar to what we do on Thanksgiving. Remind ourselves that God takes care of his people, even when it's not manifestly evident. This brings me to the unique aspects of the book of Esther, because it is kind of unique in the Bible. It doesn't fall into the narrative of the Bible. The broad narrative of the Bible is quite simple in its big picture. There's creation, and then there's stories that come up to Abraham. There's Abraham to Moses. There's Moses to David. There's David to the exile, and then there's the return from exile back to Jerusalem. And that's the end of the narrative of the Old Testament, and then that sets up for the beginning of the narrative of the New Testament, which is Jesus, that fulfills all the things of the Old Testament and brings us the full meaning of God's relationship with us, our need of forgiveness, our acceptance of Jesus as the Messiah that has been talked about through all those other stories. And that's the big narrative. But Esther doesn't fall in that narrative. It's separate from it. It happens in the capital city of the Persian Empire to people who are not following the law very strictly. They're not offering sacrifices. They're not doing purity things. They're not orthodox in that sense. And in the book of Esther, God is not mentioned even once. There's no prayer. There's no prophet. There's no mention of God. God's name does not appear. No one refers to God. God is entirely absent from this book, from this story. So that's interesting. That's different than most of the rest of the Bible. What we're doing in Esther is we're entering into a part of the Scriptures that we sometimes refer to as wisdom literature. So there's two ways to honor God. There's two ways to know God. And one is through the direct revelation, and we know that through his Son, Jesus Christ, who reveals God to us. And as we believe these things and enter into relationship with him through repentance and forgiveness of sins, we enter that special relationship. But there's another thing in the Bible, and that's called wisdom. We might call it common sense literature. Proverbs and Song of Solomon and Esther and Job, they're not really about that relationship. They're about looking at the world in terms of how it tends to work and living wisely in that context. So that's another way, and that's given to us in these books that we'll be looking at over the next little while. Esther kind of falls into that category. So it's an interesting story. I'm going to start with my conclusion. Usually I go through it first, but in Esther, God says, even when I seem absent, my plan is in my hand. God is absent in Esther. Yet when you look at the whole story in its entirety, you can't help but see that God was present in those situations. That God knew what he was doing. That God brought about the outcome that he had in mind. But he's not mentioned. So in Esther, God says, even when I seem absent, my plan is in my hand. And I think that might bring comfort to many of you. Because God does not always seem present. And you look at other people and say, oh, they had an answer to prayer and they got all this. Nothing for me. I believe in God. I seek to live well. But he kind of seems absent most of the time. Maybe all the time. And so in Esther we learn that even then his plan is in hand. He doesn't lose sight of where he's going and what he's doing in his own plan and in your life. So we're going to take a look at that. Key passages to read are Esther 4, 1-17, which kind of is the decision-making point in the story, and Esther 9, 20-32, which is the conclusion. But I submit to you that if you read those passages, you'll probably find it very difficult not to go back and read the whole story. It's probably one of the most engaging stories. I mean, it reads like a Hollywood script. The tension builds and resolves and goes up and down. So it's a good one to get into. But I encourage you to do that, as I do with each of these books as we go along. So let's summarize. If we were going to make this into a script, this story, I think it would have 3 acts and 2 interludes. So I'll go through it quickly like that. I'm not going to give you all the details. If you want the details, you need to read it yourself. But the first act is the act where Esther becomes queen. But it's an extended scene, if you will, because it begins with King Xerxes, the ruler of the Persian Empire, who puts on a party. Now, I don't know if you've been to any good parties, but this party was 180 days of drinking and boozing and carrying on. It was the party to end all parties. And he had all the high officials, all the provincial leaders of his entire empire there, and he was just showing off to the max. I'm rich, I'm powerful, I can do whatever I want. And he was putting this all on display. And kind of at the pinnacle of that party, he had this idea, I think in his drunkenness, and he should have known better, but he called on his queen to come out and show off her beauty and dance for all the drunken men. Now, I didn't know there was a women's lib movement going on back in the Persian Empire, but there was, because she refused his command. And I think they needed a stronger women's lib in those days, but she refused his summons to come and be humiliated for his pleasure before his friends. And so he got together with his advisors, and what should we do about this? And they decided that if the wife of the king can defy her husband's commands, then all craziness will break loose across the kingdom, and all the women will start doing whatever they want instead of what their husbands say. So they decide to make an example of her, and they put her to death. Now, whatever you think of that, it's meant to give us the impression, and I think it does, that this guy is powerful, that he cannot be trifled with, and that he's entirely unpredictable. He's the worst sort. He's the worst kind of man there ever has been. But then we get into the next part of this first act, and that is, well, he needs a queen. So his officials, his soldiers, go out throughout the empire and find any beautiful woman, and they have to be virgins, and they come to the castle, and they're made beautiful, and they're given their beauty treatments, and then they parade before the king, and he's going to choose one as his queen. And when he sees, and Esther is an orphan. There's no mention of her parents. She's being raised by her uncle, and she's picked up by this thing that's going on in the kingdom, and paraded before the king. And when he sees her, it's over. He picks her. She's the most beautiful. So if you think beauty pageants are just a thing in our day, they were back then too. So she's now the queen. And she's put off in the women's quarters and trained to be a queen and given all the beauty treatments and everything that goes with that. And that's the first scene. Now there's an interlude that seems to have nothing to do with the story. And this is her uncle, who's like her father, Mordecai. He's at the gates of the castle, and he overhears some people plotting to assassinate the king. And so through his niece, who's like a daughter, he gets the message to the king of this plot, and it's averted, and the king's life is saved. And then, okay, that's the end of the interlude. Then we get back into the story, Act 2. Act 2 is really about Haman, one of the king's highest advisors. Now, Haman is a man with a large ego, and he notices that when he parades through the streets, there's one man that doesn't bow to him. Now, everyone's supposed to bow low on the streets when a high official comes by in their train, and Mordecai, the uncle, father figure of Esther, refuses to bow. And so he finds out he's a Jew, and he finds out that there's Jews all over the kingdom, and he hatches this plot to kill all the Jews across the entire kingdom of Persia, which basically means all the Jews in the entire world. And the king goes along with this and puts the edicts in place, not really knowing what he's doing, and Mordecai, hearing of this, gets messages to Esther to say, you ought to go talk to the king and avert this destruction, this genocide. Now, Esther knows, because she's been trained in the court rules, that to appear before the king without being summoned is something that is worthy of the penalty of death. If you're not called to present yourself to the king and you go anyways, you'll be put to death. There's only one exception. If for some reason the king extends his scepter of power towards you, then you get to talk. And if he likes what you have to say, he might let you live. And the king hasn't summoned Queen Esther for months. And Mordecai's trying to persuade her, go to the king and save your people. So finally she goes. The king sees her and invites her to speak. And she goes through. I'm not going to tell you what she all does. There's a lot of different plot twists in there. You'll have to read it yourself. But in the end, she convinces him, and he overturns the edict, and the people are saved. But there's another interlude in the middle of that. And this is the place where the king can't sleep one night, and he asks, this would be a good way to go to sleep, he asks the historians to come and read the history books. And the historians are reading, and they read about this time when Mordecai saved the king's life. And so the king says, well, was that man ever honored for saving my life? And no, there's no record of that. Oh, we should do something for him. And so the king asks Haman the next morning, if someone is to be highly honored, what should I do? Haman thinks, of course, it's him that's going to be highly honored. So he puts out his greatest fantasy. He says, well, they should be put on the king's own horse, and a high official should be required to parade them through the streets so all the people would bow to them. And the king says, well, that's a good idea. Haman, you go get my horse, put Mordecai, your arch enemy, on my horse, and parade him through the streets, and everyone will bow. And so Haman is humiliated in that way. And again, it's not really part of the story, but it's there probably for our amusement. I don't know. It is amusing. But then the king, because of the laws of his land, cannot cancel an edict that has gone out. So the edict to kill all the Jews has gone out. So instead he produces another edict, and he says all the Jewish people ought to prepare themselves and arm themselves, and when the day comes for their destruction, they can defend themselves. And so they are successfully saved in that way. Now, you understand, God is not mentioned once. This is just a story of a bunch of crazy things that happened in a kingdom. But when you put it all together, When you look at all the details, it's very difficult to believe that this was just all coincidence. And so we learn that even when God seems absent from the story, he still has his plan in place. It's not going to be overturned by some guy like Haman with his evil plots and someone like King Xerxes who seems to act bizarrely on a whim from here to there. And so the key verse that's in one of the key passages that's most quoted from Esther is this one. This is Mordecai speaking to his niece, who's like a daughter to him, who is the queen. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place. But you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this? Who knows? Without mentioning God's name, Mordecai is saying the summary of what we are to learn from this book. God's plan will not be thwarted. It will go through. It will happen. But it might or might not involve Esther. It might or might not involve Esther. God seems absent. Now, to make this personal, I want to take that statement and I want to drill down into one scene in that story that I think might be a scene in your life as well. Imagine for a moment that you're in Esther's shoes. Now, some of you guys, it might be hard to put on those little glass slippers and pretend you're in Esther's shoes, but imagine her dilemma. Imagine her position. You never meant to be queen. You never imagined being in the palace. You don't really feel like you belong there. You weren't raised as a high official, a royalty. You break the rules all the time because you weren't raised in the palace where there's all these rules of etiquette and stuff like that. You don't fit in. Now your uncle's putting pressure on you. The uncle who raised you to go before the king, almost certainly to your death. People don't just walk into the king's presence, because the penalty for doing that is death. You're convinced, finally, that you should do it, and so you go all out. You go to the beauticians. There's rooms full of servants and people that serve you, and they give you the best treatment. And I've kind of stayed with the pictures in this one series for this, but what you see here isn't even close to what I would imagine she would look like as she does this. She's got the face paint on 2 inches thick, the hair up, the crowns on, the veils and the jewels, and she's done up to the top, as good as you can get. She's dressed to kill. She might be killed. She's got her entourage with her. She looks like a powerful woman. She's acting like a powerful woman. And you're walking down that hallway in the castle towards the king's room and his throne room. And you know, in that throne room there's a big throne and the king sitting there. And in my imagination, there's a ferocious lion chained to the one side of the thing. And if you get too close there, you'll be damaged. And there's guards around and swords and spears prickling everywhere. And it's meant to be intimidating. And it is. No one goes in there without fear. It's the most powerful man and the most violent and evil man in the world. You're walking down the hallway and you can see the guards. Indecision. Should we stop her? Does she know she's not supposed to be going this way? If we don't kill her now, we'll have to kill her after she's seen by the king. And they hesitate, but on your exterior, you're confident. You're the queen after all. You belong here. And you're marching down the hallway, and you're wondering if in the sweat of your nervousness, if your makeup's starting to drip down and you actually look horrendous instead of beautiful. And all these worries are going through your mind. What kind of mood is the king in today? Is it worth the risk? Is this really the right thing to do? I mean, surely someone else is going to do something if I don't. Is that guard giving me a look? Maybe I'm overdressed. Maybe I overdid it, and the king will hear about my presence before he actually sees me. I should just go back. I don't belong here. I'm just an orphan off the street. Who am I to do this? And there's the doorway. There's the curtain. Another step, and he will see you. And then it'll be in his hands. Will you be put to death, or will you be allowed to speak? Indecision. Should I take that step? If only there was a prophet to tell me what to do. If only there was a lightning strike. If only there was a word. If only there was a vision. If only there was a whale that would swallow me and spit me up where I'm supposed to be. If only there was something direct from God that would say this is the right choice. But there's nothing. There's nothing. God is silent. God is absent. But you have to choose what to do. You know, many of you either do now or will in the future stand in that doorway. Maybe the stakes won't be as high as they were for Esther, but they'll seem high to you because the decision you have to make is going to have an impact on your life, the life of the ones you love. And you're standing there in indecision. What should I do? I want to live a life that honors God. I want to do the right thing. I want God to lead me, but He's absent. He's not giving any indication what I should do. Sometimes we talk about doors. God opens the door. God closes the door. If God closes one door, He'll open another door. And I've said those things, and I know why we say them and what they mean, but I don't think they're good theology. The Bible doesn't back us up on that. If you look at Esther's decision, there is no open door. If she goes in, she dies. If she doesn't, she dies. There's no open door. There's no right course of action. There's no way to tell what the outcome will be. No angel spoke to her. There was no vision. Every way she turns, there's just closed doors. There's no good choice. And we often come into those situations, and sometimes we think it's because we don't have faith. Well, if I had better faith, if I was a better Christian, then God would open the way. The Bible doesn't tell us that. You know what the Bible does tell us? When you stand in the doorway, make your best judgment and act. You don't have the power to overturn God's plan, no matter what you do. God will accomplish what God wants to accomplish in this world. Sometimes you just have to do what Esther did. Gather the best advice you can. She had a long back and forth with her uncle Mordecai. She talked to her maids and the eunuchs around her that were her confidants. They had people all around fasting. We assume praying, but it doesn't say that. They were fasting. You gather the best advice you can. You gather the best wisdom that you can muster up, and then you make a decision and you act. And you don't know if it's the right decision. You don't know for sure if it's the right action because you don't know what the outcomes are going to be. But you just have to do it. And that's not wrong. That's not contrary to God. God gives us a bunch of books in His Bible that are called wisdom literature, common sense stuff. This is how you make decisions when God's not telling you directly. Become a wise person, get good advice, and make a choice. Now, it's interesting with Esther, because if you read the story through in one sitting, as you should, there's a change that happens in her. Up until this point in the story, she's very one-dimensional. She's very, I'll do whatever Mordecai tells me to do. But once she steps through that doorway, and the king sees her and allows her to speak, she becomes a full person. She schemes, she traps Haman. The stakes are high, but she seems almost playful and free. She becomes a person. She becomes full. And if you read the story with the right kind of imagination, or maybe the wrong kind of imagination, you can see the king in those banquets that follow and the conversations that he's drawn into her. And maybe even falls in love with her. But there's a different person after that. It's like she frees up. And I think it's this issue. See, the foundation is the first statement. Even when I seem absent, my plan is in my hand. You can't mess up God. I'm sorry. You're not that important. You don't have that power. You can't mess up God's plan. He's got it in hand. It's in His hand. And even when it doesn't seem like He's doing something, even when it doesn't seem like He's active, when you look back, as we do when we read the whole story of Esther, we can see that God was there. When you look back over your life, you will see that God was present, that God was leading, that He was there. But today, when you stand in the doorway of indecision, it doesn't seem like it. So this is what Esther tells us. Because you cannot mess up God's plan, make your best judgment and act. And trust Him. This is probably the underlying issue between at least half of the people that comes to a pastor's door for help. At least half. I haven't counted, but it's at least that much, probably more. The underlying issue. People are paralyzed. You are paralyzed by indecision. I want to follow God, but I don't know what to do. He's not telling me. And I think it's not because you're a bad Christian. It's not because you don't follow Him well. It's because He doesn't always tell you. He just doesn't. Sometimes you just have to make your best call and do something. And trust that He will see it through. If it was a bad decision, He'll find a way to turn you around, show you greater wisdom, probably something to learn along the way. If you remain teachable, He'll get you there. You can't harm Him. And so be like Esther. The stakes were still high as they can possibly be. But you read on after that decision and she becomes playful. She toys with Haman. She invites him to a banquet and leads him into conversations, traps him in his own deception. She's courageous. Because she decided, I'm not going to be paralyzed and do nothing. I'm going to trust that whether what I choose is the right path or the wrong path, the right door or the wrong door, God's going to see this through. God's going to get there where He wants to go. So I give you that today as an encouragement. Esther doesn't mention God. God is not really part of the story. We look back, we can see Him throughout it. She still had to decide. Don't be envious of those people who tell those stories about, oh, God told me this and God told me that. And you're like, well, God never told me anything. Well, God never told Esther anything either. But he used her to save his people. Maybe he'll use you to save one or two if you just start doing stuff and learn as you go. Because you won't mess up God by doing that. But you might mess up yourself if you don't. If you never step through and make a decision.